Mr. President.
The Republican leader.
I ask consent that further proceedings on the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, last year Congress rallied 5 times around historic bipartisan legislation to meet urgent and unprecedented needs. Our COVID-19 packages reinforced the health care front lines, fueled the sprint for vaccines, and cast lifelines for the workers and small businesses hit hardest by shutdowns. Together, those bills cost about $4 trillion, but none of those measures passed the House of Representatives with less than a bipartisan supermajority of about 80%, completely overwhelming support. Then last week, House Democrats rammed through the American Rescue Plan Act on a razor-thin margin of 50.7%. The only thing bipartisan about their bill was the opposition to it. Their bill costs about $2 trillion. That's roughly the same size as the entire CARES Act that saved our health system and economy through months of shutdowns last year. Even liberal experts admit this is far out of proportion to what's needed now, with vaccines going into arms and the economy already primed to literally roar back. Amazingly, Democrats managed to allocate less than 9% of their massive bill to the entire health care response, 9% of the $1.9 trillion related to the health care response. And listen to this, even less than 1% of the $1.9 trillion to the vaccines that will actually finish the fight. They needed to save the other 91% of the borrowed money for a vast catalog of liberal spending with basically no relationship whatsoever to beating COVID-19. For example, they want to send wheelbarrows of cash to state and local bureaucrats to bail out mismanagement from before the pandemic. They're changing the previous bipartisan funding formula in ways that will especially bias the money toward big blue states. This outraged a bipartisan group of governors, largely from Middle America, who went on record this week. There are generous new benefit packages for government employees. There are provisions to let abortion providers drain money from rescue programs that were built to save Main Street small businesses. There's a strange new Excella corridor kickback where they'll make Medicare send more money to just New Jersey, Rhode Island, and Delaware. Just looking at the time frame for all of their spending belies any notion that this is an urgent rescue plan. Take the K through 12 funding, which, contrary to science, Democrats say is a prerequisite for opening schools. 95% of that supposedly urgent money would not be spent this fiscal year, but instead over the next 7 years. Say that again, 95% of the money for K through 12 not going to be spent this year, but over the next 7 years. Not my definition of an emergency. Grants for rural health care would be on a slow drip out through fiscal 2024. Agriculture-related funds would trickle out over the next, listen to this, over the next decade. Doesn't sound very urgent to me. What the American people need are fast-acting plans to get schools reopened now, get laid-off workers back into jobs, and finish the fight against this virus right now. The Democrats have instead drawn up a liberal omnibus to fund miscellaneous government spending over the next decade. So we're adding all this money to the national debt in the name of a rescue package, with most of the money being spent out far in the future. So, Mr. President, that's why there was bipartisan opposition over in the House. That's why aspects of the House bill are already dropping like flies before this thing even hits the Senate floor. A pet project for the San Francisco Bay Area, gone. Special upgrades for a bridge connecting New York to Canada, gone. Even CNN had to admit these were, quote, controversial, end quote. Senator Sanders' far-left minimum wage policy that would have killed 1.4 million jobs just as we try to recover, that appears to be gone too, at least for now. According to public reports, right now, as we speak, several of our Democratic colleagues are frantically trying to trim back other crazy provisions. The runaway government bailouts, the policies that will keep workers at home when we should be focusing on rehiring. Just a few days ago, President Biden's chief of staff bragged that this smorgasbord of borrowed money will add up to, quote, the most progressive domestic legislation in a generation, end quote. So that's what you get when the Democratic leader persuades all of my distinguished friends across the aisle that their first undertaking as Senate committee chairman should be to outsource all their gavels to the House. Now, Mr. President, the Senate wrote the CARES Act. In the earliest days of the crisis, this chamber took the bull by the horns. I personally assembled bipartisan task forces that crafted urgent solutions that helped America weather the storm. This time around, on the substance, the Senate has been largely missing in action. House Democrats are bristling and publicly pushing back if our Senate Democratic colleagues even try to make their mark on this partisan bill in small ways. So these two radically different processes have generated two radically different pieces of legislation. The Democrats had a choice. They chose to go it alone, tack to the left, leave families' top priorities on the cutting room floor. Now, on a completely different matter, just 6 weeks into unified Democratic government, we already have another crisis brewing on our southern border. In January, Customs and Border Protection logged more than 78,000 encounters on our southwest border, more than double the figure from January of 2020. Last week, HHS sources told reporters we just logged the busiest February in the history of the Unaccompanied Alien Child program. The number of kids turning up on our border with no parents is soaring, and everyone expects the numbers to keep climbing. Now, the Biden administration is reportedly planning to reopen the same kinds of emergency shelters over which Democrats vilified the Trump administration a couple of years back. Both President Biden and his Secretary of Homeland Security have said this week they don't think this is a crisis. Not a crisis, they say? Well, if this isn't a crisis, with unaccompanied kids pouring in and exceeding capacity amid a pandemic, I'd hate to see what one looks like. The cause of this emergency is not some mystery, not mysterious at all. Everybody knows exactly what happened. The new administration explicitly campaigned on weakening border security, and 6 weeks in, they've reversed the Remain in Mexico policy, begun letting more people in a haphazard way, and broadcast confusing, mixed messages. The LA Times says, quote, Biden immigration policy stirs confusion at Mexico border. They interviewed one woman who'd crossed the Rio Grande on a smuggler's raft and was only briefly detained before being released into our country. She explained she'd specifically come because of the new Biden administration, quote, that gave us the opportunity to come. Another reporter put it this way: the message received in Tijuana and other Mexican border cities was simple. Joe Biden was now letting people in. We're not just talking about the fine details of border policy. The big backdrop behind this whole discussion is the sweeping sweeping left-wing amnesty plan that the Biden administration unveiled before they were even sworn in. They want to fast-track 11 million illegal immigrants into temporary legal status, then green cards, and then full citizenship. So, Mr. President, the far left loves this approach, but so does a certain cross-section of big business. There's a whole lot of cultural power and economic power pushing the liberal vision. As for the best interests of America's workers, well, that's not as trendy a cause in certain circles. The truth is that it's not helpful or compassionate to just open up our borders. It's not fair to American citizens and workers, but neither is it fair to the people who are being lured into a humanitarian crisis in the middle of a pandemic because they believe this Democratic administration just conspicuously turned on a neon vacancies sign. Republicans just spent 4 years making major headway on the security and humanitarian crisis at our border. It took serious policy changes. It took international diplomacy with multiple countries, and it took border enforcement. The American people would be better served if the Biden administration had chosen to build on this progress instead of rapidly trying to tear it down.